Candy's voice answered. Slim went into town. Say, you seen Lenny? You mean the big guy? Yeah, seen him around here any place? He's in here, Crooks said shortly. He went back to his bunk and lay down. Candy stood in the doorway, scratching his bald wrist and looking blindly into the lighted room. He made no attempt to enter. Tell you what, Lenny, I've been figuring out about them rabbits, Crooks said irritably. You can come in if you want. Candy said embarrassed. I don't know. Of course, if you want me to. Come on in. If everybody's coming in, you might just as well. It was difficult for Crooks to conceal his pleasure with anger. Candy came in, but he was still embarrassed. You got a nice, cozy little place here, he said to Crooks. Must be nice to have a room all to yourself this way. Sure, said Crooks. And a manure pile under the window. Sure, it's swell. Lenny broke in. You said about them rabbits? Candy leaned against the wall beside the broken collar while he scratched the wrist stump. I've been here a long time, he said. And Crooks been here a long time. It's the first time I ever been in his room. Crooks said darkly. Guys don't come into a colored man's room very much. Nobody been here but Slim. Slim and the boss. Candy quickly changed the subject. Slim's as good a skinner as I've ever seen. Lenny leaned toward the old swamper. About them rabbits, he insisted. Candy smiled. I got it figured out. We can make some money on them rabbits if we go about it right. But I get to tend 'em, Lenny broke in. George says I get to tend 'em. He promised. Crooks interrupted brutally. You guys is just kidding yourself. You'll talk about it a heck of a lot, but you won't get no land. You'll be a swamper here till they take you out in a box. I seen too many guys. Lenny here'll quit and be on the road in 2-3 weeks. Like every guy got land in his head. Candy rubbed his cheek angrily. You goddamn right we're gonna do it. George says we are. We got the money right now. Yeah, said Crooks. And where's George right now? In town at Susie's. That's where your money's going. Jesus, I seen it happen too many times. I seen too many guys with land in their head. They never get none under their hand. Candy cried. Sure they all want it. Everybody wants a bit of land, not much. Just something that was his. Somebody could live on, and there couldn't be anybody throw 'em off it. I never had none. I planted crops for darn near everybody in this state, but they wasn't my crops, and when I harvested 'em, it wasn't none of my harvest. But we gonna do it now, and don't you make no mistake about that. George ain't got the money in town. That money's in the bank. Me and Lenny and George, we're gonna have a room to ourselves. We're gonna have dogs and rabbits and chickens. We're gonna have green corn and maybe a cow or a goat. He stopped, overwhelmed with his picture. Crooks asked, You say you got most of the money? Darn right, we got most of it. Just a little bit more to get. Have it all in 1 month. George got the land all picked out, too. Crooks reached around and explored his spine with his hand. I never seen a guy really do it, he said. I seen guys nearly crazy with loneliness for land, but every time a good time or a blackjack game took what it takes. He hesitated. If you guys would want a hand to work for nothing, just as keep, why, I'd come and lend a hand. I ain't so crippled. I can't work hard and help. What changes Crook's tone about the land? Why do you think Crook volunteers to accompany and work for the men? Infer Crook's American dream. Any of you boys seen Curly? They swung their heads toward the door. Looking in was Curly's wife. Her face was heavily made up. Her lips were slightly parted. She breathed strongly, as though she had been running. Curly ain't been here, Candy said sourly. She stood still in the doorway, smiling a little at them, rubbing the nails of one hand with the thumb and forefinger of the other, and her eyes traveled from one face to another. They left all the weak ones here, she said finally. Think I don't know where they all went? Even Curly. I know where they all went. Lenny watched her, fascinated, But Candy and Crooks were scowling down away from her eyes. Candy said, "Then if you know, why you want to ask us where Curly's at?" She regarded them amusedly. "Funny thing," she said. "If I catch any one man and he's alone, I get along fine with him. But just let two of the guys get together and you won't talk. Just nothing but mad." She dropped her fingers and put her hands on her hips. "You're all scared of each other, that's what. Every one of you's scared the rest is going to get something on you." After a pause, Crooks said, "Maybe you better go along to your own house now. We don't want no trouble." "Well, I ain't giving you no trouble. Think I don't like to talk to somebody every once in a while? Think I like to stick in that house all the time?" Candy laid the stump of his wrist on his knee and rubbed it gently with his hand. He said accusingly, "You got a husband. You ain't got no call fooling around with no other guys causing trouble." The girl flared up. "Sure I got a husband. You all seen him. Swell guy, ain't he? Spends all his time saying what's he gonna do to a guy he don't like, and he don't like nobody. Think I'm gonna stay in that 2x4 house and listen how Curly's gonna lead with his left twicket and then bring in the old right cross? 1-2, he says, just the old 1-2 and he'll go down." She paused and her face lost its sullenness and grew interested. "Say, what happened to Curly's hand?" There was an embarrassed silence. Candy stole a look at Lenny. Then he coughed. "Why, Curly, he got his hand caught in a machine, ma'am. Bust his hand." She watched for a moment, and then she laughed. "Baloney! What do you think you're selling me? Curly started something and he didn't finish. Caught in a machine, baloney! Why, he don't give nobody the good old 1-2 since he got his hand bust. Who bust him?" Candy repeated sullenly, "Got it caught in a machine." "All right," she said contemptuously. "All right, cover him up if you wanna. What do I care? You bindle bums think you're so darn good. What do you think I am, a kid? I tell you, I could have went on with shows. Not just one neither. And a guy told me he could put me in pictures." She was breathless with indignation. "Saturday night. Everybody out doing something. Everybody. What am I doing? Standing here talking to a bunch of bindle stiffs. And liking it because there ain't nobody else." Lenny watched her, his mouth half open. Crooks had retired into his terrible protective dignity. But a change came over old Candy. He stood up suddenly and knocked his nail keg over backwards. "I had enough," he said angrily. "You ain't wanted here. We told you you ain't. And I tell you, you got floozy ideas about what us guys amount to. You ain't got sense enough in that chicken head to even see that we ain't stiffs. S'pose you get us canned. S'pose you do. You think we'll hit the highway and look for another lousy 2-bit job like this? You don't know that we got our own ranch to go to and our own house. We ain't gotta stay here. We got a house and chickens and fruit trees and a place 100 times prettier than this. We got friends. That's what we got. Maybe there was a time when we was scared of getting canned, but we ain't no more. We got our own land, and it's ours, and we can go to it." Curly's wife laughed at him. "Baloney," she said. "I seen too many of you guys. If you were 2 bits in the world, why you been getting 2 shots of corn and sucking in the bottom of the glass? I know you guys." Candy's face had grown redder and redder, but before she was done speaking, he had control of himself. He was the master of the situation. "I mighta knew," he said gently. "Maybe you just better go along and roll your hoop. We ain't got nothing to say to you at all. We know what we got, and we don't care whether you know it or not. So maybe you better just scatter along now, 'cause Curly maybe ain't gonna like his wife out in the barn with us bindle stiffs." She looked from one face to another, and they were all closed against her. She looked longest at Lenny, until he dropped his eyes in embarrassment. Suddenly, she said, "Where'd you get them bruises on your face?" Lenny looked up guiltily. "Who? Me?" "Yeah, you." Lenny looked to Candy for help, and then he looked at his lap again. "He got his hand caught in a machine," he said. Curly's wife laughed. "Okay, machine. I'll talk to you later. I like machines." What epiphany does Curly's wife have about Curly, Lenny, and the machine? What is her purpose in referring to Lenny as the machine? Candy broke in. "You let this guy alone. Don't you do no messing around with him. I'm going to tell George what you says. George won't have you messing with Lenny." "Who's George?" she asked. "The little guy you come with?" Lenny smiled happily. "That's him," he said. "That's the guy, and he's going to let me tend the rabbits." "Well, if that's all you want, I might get a couple rabbits myself." Crooks stood up from his bunk and faced her. "I had enough," he said coldly. "You got no rights coming in my room. You got no rights messing around in here at all. Now you just get out, and get out quick. If you don't, I'm going to ask the boss never to let you come in the barn no more." She turned on him in scorn. "Listen," she said, "you know what I can do to you if you open your trap?" Crooks stared hopelessly at her, and then he sat down on his bunk and drew into himself. She closed on him. "You know what I could do?" Crooks seemed to grow smaller, and he pressed himself against the wall. "Yes, ma'am." "Will you keep your place, then? I could get you strung upon his tree so easy it ain't even funny." Crooks had reduced himself to nothing. There was no personality, no ego, nothing to arouse either like or dislike. He said, "Yes, ma'am," and his voice was toneless. For a moment she stood over him as though waiting for him to move so that she could whip at him again, but Crooks sat perfectly still, his eyes averted, everything that might be hurt drawn in. She turned at last to the other two. Old Candy was watching her, fascinated. "If you was to do that, we'd tell," he said quietly. "We'd tell about you framing cooks." "Tell 'em be darned," she cried. "Nobody'd listen to you, and you'd know it. Nobody'd listen to you." Candy subsided. "No," he agreed. "Nobody'd listen to us." Lenny whined. "I wish George was here. I wish George was here." Candy stepped over to him. "Don't you worry none," he said. "I just heard the guys coming in. George will be in the bunkhouse right now, I bet." He turned to Curly's wife. "You better go home now," he said quietly. "If you go right now, we won't tell Curly you was here." She appraised him coolly. "I ain't sure you heard nothing." "Better not take no chances," he says. "If you ain't sure, you better take the safe way." She turned to Lenny. "I'm glad you bust up Curly a little bit. He got it coming to him. Sometimes I'd like to bust him up myself." She slipped out the door and disappeared into the dark barn. And while she went through the barn, the halter chains rattled, some horses snorted, and some stamped their feet. Crooks seemed to come by slowly out of the layers of protection he had put on. "Was that the truth what you said about the guys come back?" he asked. "Sure, I heard 'em." "Well, I didn't hear nothing." "The gate banged," Candy said, and he went on. "Jesus Christ, Curly's wife can move quiet. I guess she had a lot of practice, though." Crooks avoided the whole subject now. "Maybe you guys better go. I ain't sure I want you in here no more." Candy said, "She ought not have said that to you." "It wasn't nothing," Crooks said dully. "You guys coming in and setting made me forget. What she says is true." The horses snorted out in the barn, and the chains rang, and a voice called, "Lenny! Oh, Lenny! You in the barn?" "It's George!" Lenny cried, and he answered, "Here, George! I'm right in here!" In a second George stood framed in the door, and he looked disapprovingly about. "What are you doing in Crook's room? You hadn't ought to be here." Crooks nodded. "I told 'em, but they came in anyways." "Well, why'd you kick 'em out?" "I didn't care much," said Crooks. "Lenny's a nice fella." Now Candy aroused himself. "Oh, George, I've been figuring and figuring. I got it doped out how we can make some money on them rabbits." George scowled. "I thought I told you not to tell anybody about that." Candy was crestfallen. "Didn't tell nobody but Crooks." George said, "Well, you guys get out of here. Jesus, seems like I can't go away for a minute." Candy and Lenny stood up and went toward the door. Crooks called, "Candy." "Huh?" "Remember what I said about hoeing and doing odd jobs?" "Yeah," said Candy, "I remember." "Well, just forget it," said Crooks. "I didn't mean it. Just fooling. I wouldn't want to go to no place like that." "Well, okay, if you feel like it. Good night." The three men went out the door, and as they went through the barn the horses snorted and the halter chains rattled. Crooks sat in his bunk and looked at the door for a moment. Then he reached for the liniment bottle. He pulled out his shirt and back, poured a little liniment in his pink palm, and reaching around, he fell slowly to rubbing his back.